So if you've been following Diablo 4, you'll have probably heard that Season 4 is going to be incredibly important for the future health of the game. One of the big reasons being that there's going to be a complete itemization overhaul coming with Season 4, which is going to be a pretty substantial change to come with the season, but there's also a ton of other changes and content additions that have been teased to be coming with Diablo 4. And I think a lot of the player base hasn't heard a lot of this information. So in this video, I want to go over all of the information we have for Season 4, go over all of the different teases of possible additions to give a good idea of what you can expect in the season. Because I think Season 4 is going to be by far and away the biggest season we've had. And I don't think it's going to be even close. Because also keep in mind, even though we're getting things like an itemization overhaul and a bunch of other pretty big changes and additions, we are still getting the normal seasonal content you would expect. So there's going to be a new seasonal mechanic, there's going to be new seasonal content, and there's probably going to be a big new progression mechanic like the Seneschals or like the vampiric powers. And Season 4 is also going to mark the first time in Diablo 4 where we're going to get a PTR for a future season or future piece of content. And we did get confirmation that we will be getting the details for the PTR developer livestream and the PTR release date within, say, a week and a half. So not only is Season 4 going to be pretty massive, but you'll be able to play it early if you own Diablo 4 on Battle.net, and that also means that all the players will be able to directly test everything. So this season is not only going to be the absolute biggest season by far, but it's probably going to be the smoothest launch in terms of bugs and balancing. And the most anticipated part of Season 4 obviously being the itemization overhaul. Itemization has been one of the most disliked parts of Diablo 4, and there's a bunch of different reasons for that. One of them being there's just too many affixes, a lot of them being not very good, so it's very hard to find really well-rolled items. It's also pretty annoying to compare new items you get to the items you're wearing to see if that item is better than what you're currently wearing. A lot of this being caused because there's so many useless stats and because there's so many conditional stats. Even the developers memeing about this, being the whole damage on Tuesday thing where you need some conditional to do additional damage, so it feels like your affix doesn't work half the time, but then you're super strong half the time. And just by how the developers have been talking about that specifically, I would assume a lot of the conditional affixes are probably going to be removed and completely replaced with something else, or just removed to try to slim down the list of affixes. And something that hasn't been talked about, but I think may be a possibility, is that some of the effects from the Seneschal Companion from Season 3 may have also been tests for some of the itemization reworks, because usually how game development works is basically anything that's added into a video game now has some amount of backend systems and coding that can make something similar in another system work much more easily. This is actually very apparent in something like World of Warcraft, where they would develop a new system for an expansion, they will leave that specific system behind, but the tech that they created for that system is just used for every future expansion. And I think some of the Seneschal support stones may specifically be things that could work with the itemization overhaul. Stuff like arcing support, the supported skill now hits additional enemies, multi-shot support, so supported projectile skills launch additional projectiles, and piercing support, so the supported projectile will now pierce multiple enemies. All of these could potentially be affixes with an itemization overhaul. A lot of other ARPGs have like multi-shot, where instead of one projectile it shoots say two, which can then be scaled up to have a lot more. So things like this could potentially be in the itemization overhaul to give a lot more interesting and fun affixes. Because if they added an affix that just gave you basically multi-shots, so multiple projectiles come out, there's actually a ton of projectile-based builds that could potentially now be ridiculously good because of a new affix like that. And we've gotten some pretty big teasers from developers regarding the itemization overhaul. One of them being that the itemization overhaul is going to be so big and such a massive change to the game that they decided to not make a loot filter earlier, because if they made a loot filter before the itemization overhaul, it would legitimately not work with the new itemization being overhauled. And I think a big reason why this comment is so interesting is because this means the itemization overhaul would have to touch a lot more more than just base affixes on items. So I think this is pointing to the itemization overhaul, touching a lot more pieces of the game than just changing up affixes, adding new ones, and removing ones that players don't like. And likewise, we've actually gotten to hear developers talk a little bit more about their general idea of where they're going with itemization, and this being that once you get an item, that's basically the start of a journey for that item to become really good or maybe even get bricked. And this is much more similar to other ARPGs like PoE or Last Epoch, where you can get an item that maybe isn't that good or maybe has one or two things you want, and then you can use their various crafting systems to try to turn it into like a very well-rolled item or even a best in slot rolled item. And this seems to be more the direction they're going. Now, I don't think it's going to be as complex as PoE. It could potentially get to a similar point to something like Last Epoch, but it's definitely going to need to be something that's much easier to understand than something like Path of Exile. But I do think this is the correct direction to be going. A big itemization overhaul and then adding a lot more crafting features into the game. So once you get an item, it doesn't feel like you're just getting an item and then rolling one stat. It feels like, oh, if I get an item with maybe one or two things I want on it, I could potentially go craft this into like a best in slot rolled item. This also means that a lot more items are going to be valuable. Instead of 99% of items you pick up being completely useless, it can now be, say, only 90% of items are completely useless. And now you have like this 10% window to try to go craft all these items into something really good. And then we've also gotten a lot of teases and basically outright saying that the aspect overhaul or pretty big aspect changes are also going to be coming with the itemization overhaul. And if you haven't heard about this, this was pretty much announced at BlizzCon, but the Diablo 4 developers have been working on a system to remove all aspects as items outside of the game. So right now, you'll probably have one or two stash tabs completely filled up with aspects. Especially when you're leveling up, going up to level 100, you're saving any aspects you may need for any build you may want to try. Dozens and dozens of items that you basically just have to save that's taking up a bunch of space. But the system they're working on is to remove all of those aspects and just add it into the Codex of Power. Now, we don't know exactly how this is going to work. Presumably, all these aspects you're obtaining from items just go directly into the Codex, and there'll probably be like some listing of all of the different aspects you currently have. You can go into there, select one, put it on an item directly from that same NPC, and now you don't have to worry about any aspect items in the game. This would save you a massive amount of space through your stash and in your actual inventory. So this would just be a big quality of life change while also allowing you to just save a lot more actual pieces of gear you want in your stash. Now that's most of the information we have pertaining directly to the itemization overhaul for Season 4, but that's not the only teases we've gotten for Season 4. Because as I mentioned, there's going to be a PTR to test Season 4, primarily because there's going to be such a big change to the itemization, but the developers have also teased a bunch of additional content and specifically endgame content for Season 4. In their Q&A, they were asked recently if there's going to be any new endgame content, and they said they can't talk about it, but they would definitely recommend if you're someone that wants new endgame content to keep an eye out for the PTR and for Season 4, kind of directly saying that there's going to be a pretty big emphasis on the new content for Season 4 being very endgame focused. And then they also got another question about the Abattoir of Zir or getting an Abattoir of Zir like piece of content. And we also got another tease that if you're looking for something like Abattoir of Zir, they would also recommend checking out the PTR and checking out Season 4 in a wink, wink, nudge, nudge type of way. So it does seem like we're going to get endgame focused content with Season 4, whether that be permanent to the game or specific to Season 4. And it also seems like there's going to be some type of Abattoir of Zir like system. And I think even though Abattoir of Zir launched in not the best state, I do think that piece of content after they did some changes to it is actually something that would be very good for the permanent health of Diablo 4. So if I would have to guess, I would say a system similar to that, which was also similar to like Greater Rifts from Diablo 3, would be something that they would want to permanently add into the game. Abattoir of Zir was obviously more of a test, and my overarching theory is that was kind of a test to basically add in rifts or Greater Rifts from Diablo 3 into Diablo 4, because we already have the hundreds of dungeons, new dungeons added every season that are kind of these specific dungeons, a little bit of randomization, but specific dungeons you go to. So now they could add in something like rifts, which are fully randomized tile sets, enemies. So you could have kind of the best of both worlds. You could have the dungeons you go to that you know what you're getting with that dungeon. Then you could have this new system like rifts that are much more randomized. Now, this is a lot of the more concrete information we have for what's actually coming with season 4. It's not too long, like I mentioned, a week and a half before we get to check out the PTR and get more information. But there's also some additional stuff that may be in season 4. And these are just things that developers have said that they are working on, but they don't have a date for. So one of the big things being an armory. This was talked about a decent bit at BlizzCon during the Q&A, where the team is working on an armory system, and an armory system being a way to basically save the entirety of a build in an armory and be able to switch between the entirety of builds. So you'd be able to save like every piece of your gear, your talent loadout, your Paragon board loadout. You'd be able to save basically every part of your build in that armory. So if you want to go switch back to that build, you can basically do it with the single click of a button. And they even talked about this in the most recent Q&A, that when developing Diablo 4, they were developing a bunch of it with stuff harkening back to Diablo 2, where a lot more stuff was a lot more permanent. In fact, when Diablo 2 launched, you couldn't even respec. That was actually added in later updates, I think the first expansion. And they mentioned that as they've continued to develop Diablo 4, it seems that that's just not what a lot of players want. So this is also one of the reasons why they've been developing an armory and giving us all these other options to be able to respec much more easily. Lowering the gold cost, being able to fully respec your Paragon board with one click. A bunch of these changes are going much more in the direction of just being able to create as many builds as you want and then save those builds and switch between them when you want. And likewise with social features, which I actually think is one of the weakest parts of Diablo 4. Diablo 4 is supposed to be a shared world experience, something similar to like Destiny 2. It's not a full MMO, but you still have that shared world. You may even consider it like an MMO light, but basically none of those systems were in Diablo 4. You have like a trade chat and that's basically it. And this is actually one of the things that have been mentioned multiple times that the teams working on Diablo 4 are actually pretty focused on. And I would assume that this means this is going to come in a pretty massive overhaul or addition to the game with social features. Now we know this seems that raids are coming with the first expansion, so I would say we could probably expect some pretty massive additions to social features coming to a season before the first expansion or with the first expansion. So there's a possibility we could see some new social features with season 4, but that's pretty much all the information I could find for what is coming with season 4. So I think season 4 is going to be a pretty big change to Diablo 4. If you're somebody that was disappointed with Diablo 4, it might be a pretty big change to increasing your enjoyment of the game. If you're somebody that's like Diablo 4, this is just going to be a pretty big plus as well, because with the itemization overhaul, I don't even think there's a way for them to not make it an improvement to the game. We already know they're going to be changing or removing a lot of the conditional affixes. Just removing a bunch of the conditional affixes from the game would legitimately make the itemization better, and we know that's kind of the minimum they're doing. So I think the itemization overhaul itself is probably going to be a pretty big positive for the game, and then just getting new content is pretty much always going to be good. But that's pretty much all I want to go over, so thanks for watching.